I'll do both. Okay, first of all, I'm going to look at a brief question from Robert Johansson from 3 weeks ago. And his question is, hi Culadasa, would you say that drinking ayahuasca is against the fifth precept? What's your opinion regarding similar substances in relation to TMI practice? Um, the simple answer, Robert, is no, in most cases. Now, you mentioned ayahuasca in particular, and it is a strange person who would drink ayahuasca in search of mindlessness or with an expectation of mindlessness. In my experience, I have used ayahuasca. I have used psilocybin mushrooms. I have used Muscaria amanita. I have used San Pedro cactus. I have used peyote ceremonially. I have used mescaline. I have used LSD. I have smoked the crystallized secretions of the Sonoran Desert toad, which are a very potent form of DMT. I have smoked Salvia divinorum, and I'm sure I've missed a few. And what I can say about all of those things is that they have a tremendous potential for helping you in the exploration and understanding of your own mind, that people are using well, they started out back in the 60s exploring the potential therapeutic uses of these substances. And of course, that got interrupted when they were rescheduled and it was impossible to use them for those purposes. They were also widely used for just recreational purposes, which would be in violation of the fifth precept. Now, once again, they are being investigated scientifically, not just for their therapeutic potential, but also as a potential means of accelerating the process that that meditation practices and spiritual practices are intended to bring about. So in that sense, they are being investigated as an adjunct. Now, what I will say about all of these substances, and it's most especially true of ayahuasca, because and ayahuasca and peyote are very similar in that the sickness, the physical nausea and vomiting, and the degree of disturbance of your mental processes can be such that it is anything but recreational. But for all of these, for maximum benefit, if you were actually using them seriously as a part of your spiritual path, I would recommend that you use them with somebody who is very skilled in their use, either somebody with who has a background in therapy or psychology and is helping guide you as the user in the psychotherapeutic benefits of them, or in a ceremonial spiritual setting with an ayahuasquero or a Native American church recognized roadman in the case of peyote, or with a member of the, I can't remember what the name is, but it doesn't matter. There is a Native American order that has used the psilocybin mushrooms for centuries. They do it very ceremonially. That is true of all of these things, as to use them in the spiritual and ceremonial context, understanding the point of them and being being guided, then they are by no means in contradiction to the fifth precept. So the fifth precept, although it specifically mentions alcohol in its traditional presentation, really refers to anything that dulls the mind. And nowadays we have all kinds of things, including computer games, social media, and Netflix, and everything else, which have the potential to be mindfulness robbing and mind numbing uh, uh, occupations of your time. And I actually believe network television is responsible for a great degree of the dementia that we see in older adults since the advent of television in 1950. So that's as much as I want to say about that, Robert. Would anybody else like to comment on that? Or I'll tell you, if you've ever done a death meditation, you've never done a death meditation like the one that you would do after using Amanita muscaria. Yeah. That's a red mushroom with little white dots all over it. It is potentially lethal if you take too much of it. But if you want a death meditation, do it with somebody who knows what they're doing.
Do you have some book recommendations or something like, that's one area that a lot of even Buddhist monks are not very open to teaching. Like I've searched on YouTube.
Well, somewhere buried in my library, I may have some very, very old things on it. It hasn't been a particular interest of mine recently. I know people have sent me recent research papers. There's a lot of new information available. I think you could probably research it yourself, or see if you could get in touch. I mean, if you start wandering around on the internet looking under these topics, you're going to come up with the names of a few people at research institutions who are working with these things, either in conjunction with meditation, spiritual practice research, or therapeutic research. And those are the points that you could use as jumping off points for your own research. And Bill, you have a suggestion or comment?
One source is also on the web, Arrowwood. Arrowwood has really a vast storehouse of firsthand experiences, as well as scholarly articles on all sorts of different entheogens or
Yes.
such materials.
Yes,
How do you spell that?
that's a real entheogen. I'll put it in the Zoom.
The site is Arrowwood, EROWID.
Okay, thank you.
Culadasa, I think that well, listen, I'm very torn about this. I have a colleague who is a psychologist who is doing research into the benefits of things like LSD for major depressive disorder and things like that. I do think that since we're talking in a sort of public forum here, it's really important to mention that there are risks involved with taking these kinds of substances. Drug-induced psychosis is a real thing. I have several colleagues who work with this on a regular basis. This is not a risk-free choice to take. Yeah, we're all adults and we can do our research and we can do all of that. But I think we need to be careful about endorsing this as a way to enlightenment or awakening.
I'm not endorsing it for that. I'm just saying that I played around with it. You're absolutely right. There's a lot of danger in this. And as a lot of you realized, just simply doing things like Mahasi noting practice can lead to psychotic breaks, which is something that there's an accumulating literature on. if that can do that, then you can well imagine how these mind-altering substances, there is no one who is free from psychological and emotional trauma, much of which is often unresolved and buried. And both meditation and these psychoactive substances have the potential to bring these up, and to bring these up in a way and with a force that you cannot cope with. And you can end up with a psychotic breakdown. You can end up actually being hospitalized for months. And that's the worst possible outcome, because then you're going to be treated with a lot of drugs that do a lot more damage than even the ones that cause the psychotic break. So, yeah, the risk,
and I think this is what I like so much about The Mind Illuminated, is that developing samatha seems to be, with its focus on tranquility and joy and peace and calm and all of that, it seems to be as risk-free as it can get with this kind of exploration that we're doing of what we are as human beings.
Could I add something here, Culadasa?
Sure, Wayne.
Okay, thank you. And Juno, I agree completely with you. I personally avoid any sort of thing along that path. But yeah, I know a gentleman, myself and another person worked with for several months, helping him recover from a single trip. And what it did to him was it crashed his state. It crashed him into a state of spiritual enlightenment that, if you listen to the language of it, sounded like, wow, it shoved him way down the path, how wonderful for him. But it pushed him into almost a psychosis, because it did it in a way that was so unbalanced and he was unprepared for, that it actually developed into a threat of nihilism. I mean, it was just like, it put him it dissolved all the boundaries of self, but it made his mind went directions that were just toxic. And he was working with myself and one other person, a very skilled psychiatrist, and 2 or 3 other people. So he was getting about 5 hours a week of help for a period of several months just to recover from that one event. So yeah, I just personally am very cautious.
Yes, I really thank you for adding that. That is really valuable. To put this in perspective, the mind is a system. It's an extremely complex system. And when you perturb a system, it can sometimes, that perturbation can sometimes produce much greater disturbances than the system actually has the resilience to withstand. Now, the thing about meditation is that it's dangerous. And meditation itself is dangerous because it focuses only on certain parts of the system. And as the Dalai Lama said, when this was brought to his attention, he said, the Buddha taught an 8-fold path. He didn't just teach meditation. And the way that I would put it is, we're dealing with, as I say, a very complex system with many parts. And to be awakened to one aspect, for example, just to have the boundaries of the self and the mechanisms that sustain those boundaries disappear without any of the other changes to the other parts of the system that are associated with it, it's not the desired outcome at all. And it just shows, if anything, it's the demonstration that just bringing about some aspect in isolation that may in fact be a part of awakening is not awakening. It can be dangerous, or it can just be a delusion. And that's, I'd say, one of the benefits of having a background with psychedelic substances many years ago is I realized the mind is capable of generating any kind of reality in any kind of experience that you can conceive of, and then probably about 10 times as many more that you couldn't conceive of until they happened to you. Bottom line, just because you have an experience, I don't care what the experience is, it is next to meaningless except in a much, much larger context. Experiences in isolation mean nothing. This is one of the biggest problems I see with the pragmatic Dharma movement. Experience chasing, and then attaching huge values to isolated experiences. That's not what the Dharma is about. That's not what the Buddhist teaching is about. That's not what any form of spirituality I've ever encountered is about. The experiences themselves are trivial. It's the transformation of the mind in its totality, and the shifts in perspective, and that I used the plural there, the shifts, multiple shifts, which complement each other to bring you to a way of seeing things that is what we would describe as a more spiritually advanced way of seeing and understanding things. And because the mind is such a complex system, there can be many degrees of this process. It's not just that somebody has an isolated experience. It doesn't really mean that they've had any awakening at all. That's one example. Somebody can have made 90% of the shifts necessary. They seem to be awakened in every other way, but there's some part of the mind system that's still stuck in a previous mode of functioning, and that has the potential to show up. So, yeah, that was a good question, because I got a chance for us all to share a number of things. I'll share another thing with you too. Along with the experiments in psychoactive substances are a lot of experiments going on with different forms of brain stimulation and inhibition. I won't go into them, but the thing that's problematic in the research in both of these areas is too much of this idea that you're going to find some simple way to bring about a reorganization of the most complex dynamic system that we know of in the universe. And this kind of old-fashioned, linear, narrow, non-systems thinking that is driving much of the research into technical modalities and pharmacologic modalities is itself the biggest obstacle to success of those. If they can be seen as as potentially useful tools, just as any one particular meditation practice or spiritual practice could be seen as one tool amongst many. You do not build a house with just a hammer or just a saw, right? So, all right, fun. All right, let's, the other old question that I wanted to deal with is one by Michael Wood, and it was asked also 3 weeks ago prior to the last of these sessions. And Michael says, the main things keeping me from consistently being in stage 5 are persistent distractions in my face. I often feel a strong tension-like energy in between my eyes or on the bridge of my nose that automatically draws my attention every in-breath. I feel that my introspective awareness is strong and persistent. It isn't my thoughts that are keeping me from overcoming this gross distraction, so much as these persistent sensations in my face and eyes. And what is your advice for this? Now, first of all, Michael, you don't mention this, but Ricardo does, that this sounds very much like what I describe as a part of the PT phenomena. In the development, in the process of development of PT, a lot of strange sensations arise. And in some people, these arise much earlier and are much more persistent than the progression that's described in the book. Now, in the book, in the very beginning, I acknowledge that these things can happen early on, and basically just leave it with encouraging people to, so that has happened, and that's interesting, and yeah, that's something that will have much more significance later on. Don't get attached to it and don't pursue it. Since I wrote the book, and as a result of writing the book, I've been in contact with many, many more meditators with a much greater variety of backgrounds. And I've discovered that these kinds of phenomena are much more common than I had realized and much more persistent rather than something that happens and it happens for a while and then it goes away. And some people, these things that I treat as aspects of the development of PT. And I'm coming from a traditional perspective when I say that. I do have a little bit more of a modern scientific perspective on that, but I don't know that this is the time and place to get into that. But what you're experiencing is the arising of PT. Now, and where you're experiencing it is not at all uncommon in the way you're experiencing it. You don't mention it, but that may often be associated with a sense of pressure in the forehead or even the top of the head. Believe it or not, all of these things have been described in some texts going back hundreds of years old as phenomena that occurred in meditation. As to what to do with it, you remember that what I suggest is when something strongly draws your attention, you finesse the situation by deliberately making it the object of your attention. So when you find this sensation is drawing your attention, just focus your attention on it. Now, the way to treat that focus of attention, read what I say in stage 4 about dealing with pain, okay? That sensory experience, observe it objectively. Don't analyze it. Don't create a story around it. Don't, quote, think about it. Make it the focus of your attention and observe it just as much as you would passively observe the sensations of breathing in and breathing out. Observe that sensation. You have a little bit different objective, though, than you do when you're observing the breath. And that is to be able to very honestly think to yourself, okay, these sensations are there. Are they a big deal? Are they a problem? No. Well, let me just try to let them be there and bring my focus back to my breath. You might have to repeat that process a few times. You might have to, it might not work the first time or the first half dozen times. You may find yourself tempted, and if you are, do so very mindfully, to reach up and to rub that area where you're feeling that. Go ahead, do what it takes. What you want to do, though, is don't let attention move independently to that. If your attention is going to go to it, focus your intention on it on purpose and maintain your mindfulness. And do so with the objective of getting to the point that you can just let it be there. Let it come, let it be, and let it go when it's ready to. And maybe it'll never go away. Maybe it'll just get stronger. This is exactly what you'll have to do when these things start arising very commonly in stage 8. And this may happen for you sooner, since you're experiencing PT sooner rather than later. This may not go away, and it may become stronger as you work your way through stage 5 and 6 and 7, rather than being something you deal with at stage 8. Ultimately, it is something that you're going to let be there until it resolves itself. You're not doing anything about it except accepting it. But through accepting it, you're allowing processes that you have no control over, Not that you really have any control over anything, but there is that illusion. Let go of that illusion as far as these sensations go, and let them take care of themselves. Let them be there. There's a positive side to this, and you should focus on that. Not that this sensation is a distraction and it's pulling my attention away, or that it's uncomfortable, or that it's annoying, or anything else. Rather, that's a positive sign. Thousands of meditators over thousands of years have experienced this, and it's always been the prelude to something that was really, really good. And so that takes me directly to your question, Ricardo, which for those of you who are following me on these, was one that he had just added, according to my page here, 11 hours ago. If I refreshed it, it might be longer than that. I'm going to skip your question number 1 and just go question number 2, Ricardo. As you say, I've been meditating almost daily for almost a year. My sits usually last around 20 minutes and sometimes up to an hour. I believe I'm around stage 4. When I'm very focused, and I see that word and immediately I want to know, what do you mean by that? Well, you tell me. Thank you for that. When I'm very focused, I tend to feel some sort of tingling sensation on my right ear as if it was swollen and vibrating. The more focused I feel, the stronger it gets. And then you say, this is what I would be asking you if you hadn't already said it. What do you mean by more focused? And you say, by more focused, I mean wider awareness and more stable attention. And that that's a thumbs up. That's not the typical meaning of the word focus for most people, but for me, that's exactly what I'd like you to mean by it. So great. But anyway, back to your question and the problem you raise. You say, sometimes I even get it on both ears, or it starts crawling to the rest of my head. That's what PT sensations do. At some point, I start feeling this energy even when I'm not meditating. Yep, PT sensations do that as well. Here's a wonderful thing. I asked my partner if it was indeed swollen or if there was anything strange with it, and she said it looked normal. See, that is really good. It's really nice to get that. That helps you to look at it objectively and say, okay, this is something that's arising in my consciousness. I don't have to worry about my ear. I don't have to go see a doctor or something like that. That's great. That helps to clean the slate and just allow you, if it's necessary, to take it as a focus of attention until you can just let it be there. And you do ask, can this sustained feeling be a sign of PT? It is such a typical sign of PT, yes. The answer is yes. You say, I'm reluctant to believe it, as I also believe I'm in stage 4. And as I said when I was answering the earlier question, since the book is published and so many more people are using this and I'm hearing from them, I've realized that the rising of PT early on is not at all uncommon, much more common than I had thought. So this is not an indication that judgment of the stage you're in is wrong. And you go on to say, even if in the good sits, I get a few gross distractions, I still get them. Sometimes they even throw me into forgetting and mind wandering. Maybe I'm in stage 2, 3, haha. The cool thing about these sensations on my right ear is that I get a very direct and clear feedback about how focused I am and can thus correct more easily. So that's wonderful. So you know what to do with them, and you have a positive aspect to counteract any kind of resistance that might arise in your mind as a result of this. So between what I've just said and my answer to the previous questioners, Ricardo, would you like to say anything more or ask anything more?
I have just one more question regarding to what you said to the answer before. So you said this process of PT development can start before, like in earlier stages, and it will also conclude before, like it might conclude in stage 6 or 7, I don't know. Is that so?
a peak. It won't necessarily conclude. It might
Right.
reach a peak and then subside somewhat. Okay,
Mhm.
so just to clarify that.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thanks.
You might start experiencing all of the sensations associated with the development of pacification of the senses, ringing in your ears, light, filling your visual field even though your eyes are closed. All of those other things might happen as well.
Right.
And
Thank you.
thank you very much for that link to Lee Brasington, where he's talking about the liking and wanting centers and the role that the different neurotransmitters play. Yeah, that is something that's very helpful. I noticed that Lee is making a little bit of a common mistake there. Well, I'd have to go to the page that you referenced there, but just bring home the fact that what you're after is not to cease experiencing the Vedanas of pleasant and unpleasant. Liking, you're not interested in liking going away. If liking goes away for a while, so what? It's no different than all kinds of other things that happen. It'll come back. Liking is always going to be there, and so is not liking. What doesn't, and what's always going to be there doing its appropriate job is the wanting. Like, for example, when you're standing in the sun and it's starting to burn your skin, you're going to want to move into the shade, and that's going to be really healthy. That's not the same thing as when that circuit becomes hypersensitized and you experience craving. You know, it's its job. It has a job to do. When it's doing its job properly, there's no addiction, there's no craving, there's no behavior that is inherently unwholesome and harmful to yourself and others. So thanks for that link. I appreciated it. And
Cool. I'm glad you liked it.
yeah, and all of the others of you that are, since you have access to the question, you have access to that link. And I'm glad that I'm glad to see that Lee and other teachers he's not the only one. I think, hasn't Shinzen been talking about that somewhat recently? Elizabeth, would you know?
What was he talking about? Sorry.
The different centers in the brain involving liking and disliking versus wanting.
I'm not, he's talked a lot, obviously, recently about brain research. I'm not sure if he's talked about that, but
Okay.
it wouldn't surprise me. I don't know.
I sometimes conflate different people. That there are some other teachers who have seized upon this. Yeah, but I like the fact that Lee made just a little bit of a sidestep there, which I can correct. The goal is not the Vedana of neither pleasant nor unpleasant. It's the Vedana is not having an unwholesome wanting arising in response to either. And that's the definition of equanimity as well. So, all right, good. Yes.
Maybe just to follow on, since we're talking about PT at whatever stage, I mean, at one point you said, you don't want to be craving this thing, but then the other thing, especially as people are going up in the stages, is to have the curiosity to begin to explore and to begin to notice any sense of well-being or pleasure that's associated with PT, because we're also talking about rapture and bliss and the beginning of the jhanas.
Right.
And so if this is beginning even early, we're all along with TMI, we're looking for the pleasantness of the sensations that are arising. And could you say a little bit more about the art of doing that with PT and these energetic sensations?
In all of these things, it is to be really open to the experience that's arising in the moment. Now that is going to be, you know, your protection against against chasing after them and letting there be a craving associated with that. Just an objective openness that, wow, this is happening. You know, if I there's certain drugs that I took that if I took them, they'd make me feel good. And I would know that it was the chemical substance that was got in my bloodstream that was making me feel good. So something's making me feel good. And just as hopefully you would have the sense not to start taking tons of that chemical substance just so you would feel good, you would just say, oh, this is nice. It feels good. Likewise with discomfort. Yes, anything that positively reinforces your ability to do the practices rather than succumb to another kind of craving, a craving to do something else instead. And that includes a craving to pursue the rapture and joy that arises as a part of PT. You know, you want to use that pleasantness. You want to say, the only reason I'm experiencing this rapture and joy is because of the practice I was doing. And so let me keep doing the practice because it promises so much more than just rapture and joy. And so that's the way to approach it. So use it by all means. You're not going to be free from the tendency for craving to arise for a long, long time yet. And you're going to have to work through all kinds of progressively subtler layers of craving. While it's there, this is all part of pulling yourself by the bootstraps, up by your bootstraps. When you're just a beginner, feel good about 3 breaths in a row and you didn't get off into mind wandering. When you get up to the higher stages, feel good about the fact that as there's unification of mind, pleasure arises. That will keep you on track with doing the practice. Just never forget that this is just an effect of the practice. It's not the goal of the practice. And so let it help you in continuing with the practice. If it's unpleasant and resistance arises, you can treat it exactly the same way. This is an effect of the practice along the way. It's not the goal, nor is avoiding it the goal. It's just letting it be there. And if you can get in touch with the fact that something that's uncomfortable is not that uncomfortableness, that the Vedana of unpleasantness associated with that sensation is not the problem. It's the Vedana of unpleasantness that makes you experience strong dissatisfaction, otherwise known as dukkha. That's the literal meaning of dukkha, dissatisfaction. That's the problem. So, you know, whether you're dealing with sukha or dukkha, recognize them for what they are and accept them. But you don't need to let craving arrive. So it's an opportunity to explore them when they arrive. And it's inevitable that a certain degree of desire or aversion will rise in association with these. This too is an opportunity. You know, it's like, wow, I see it. You know, I can see it coming up here in this strongly aware, attentionally focused state. I can see how the wanting circuit, how the craving gets activated secondarily, and that it doesn't have to happen. But since it does, I'm going to use it as a way to learn and help me progress. All right, let's see what's next here. I will go to, once again, oh, Juno, Juno, your question is, I love your question.
Yeah, I thought that's a tough question. I think that could merit its own whole long discussion, right?
Yeah, well, we could talk about it. We could talk about it. We could have a very long discussion about it, but I'll try to keep it to a reasonable length because I want to answer some of these other questions as well. Oh, by the way, Ricardo, I am sorry, but I don't know who there would be in Chile who would be experienced in TMI and could teach you. Um, Once again, it's wonderful that we have the internet, this worldwide network, that may help you find somebody. But also, given things like these Zoom meetings, you don't necessarily have to find somebody that to, I mean, it's wonderful to have a personal relationship with somebody, at least pre-COVID. Pre-COVID virus, it was wonderful to have a personal relationship with a teacher and have contact with them. But one of the things that we have learned is that you don't need that. So you might be able, if you can't find somebody in Chile, then you can find somebody perhaps that you can still get guidance from and interact with via Zoom. Anyway, back to Juno's question. And I'm just going to, I think I'll read it and I might comment as I read it. Okay. So I know this is a complex topic without definitive answers. Actually, not as much as you'd think. But could you give us your thoughts about the relationship between awakening and the Brahma Viharas? And then you say, if a person practices TMI without ever trying, for example, metta practice, will they still develop those qualities? So you're asking about a relationship between the phenomenon known as awakening and the Brahma Viharas, okay? So that's one relationship. Now, you go on and you continue your question. You say, could a person, for example, and when you say the for example, it sounds to me like you're conflating that first relationship, and I'm going to ask you not to. Could a person have highly realized wisdom, yet still behave in an unethical or uncompassionate way? And if so, how come? Now, so I said, you asked about the relationship between awakening and the Brahma Viharas, and then you've asked a question about awakening and ethical behavior. You used the word ethical, and and compassion. What you're really, I would see it, there's awakening, there's the Brahma Viharas, those four, loving kindness, compassion, joy, sympathetic joy, and equanimity. And then here is behaviors, moral and or ethical and or virtuous. So I would say you're asking about the relationships, you're asking about three relationships between three things. Okay.
Possibly. I just don't think, I don't know what the distinction would be between those, Brahma Viharas and ethics. I kind of think they flow into each other.
Well, I actually, what I would say, this has to do with why it seems like a complex question.
Yeah.
It seems like a complex question in the absence of a clear understanding of what each of these three are.
Yeah.
And even if we take a really appropriate approach and say, well, there are multiple definitions for each of these, and we could explore the relationships using the combinations of different definitions of these. So then that's a way of making it less complex. But if we don't make it clear what we mean by each of these three things, then it's not going to be complex. It's just going to be absurdly confusing, and it's not going to.
Yeah.
It's not going to be any benefit at all. So let's. So the answer depends on how we define these things. And let's start with awakening. So I'm not going to include under that term any kind of magical or supernatural powers, okay? Including any kind of omniscience. What I'm going to say, awakening is a profound cognitive shift that we are looking at one of the most complex dynamic systems, well, the most complex and dynamic system we know of in the world. Whether you look at it as the brain or whether you look at it as the mind, and we're going to look at it as the mind. So it's a very complex system, and awakening involves that system discovering and reinforcing a new stable state by which it processes incoming information and produces action as a result of that information, okay? So awakening involves perceiving things in a very different way than the common person does. Very different way than what the Buddha referred to as a worldling does. And we can define those different ways in terms of the three characteristics and dependent or codependent arising and emptiness. We can define that shift in perspective in terms of those 5 things. So when we're talking about awakening, we're talking about a shift within a complex system that involves the entire system. It is cognitive in its fundamental nature, and I'm afraid I'd have to refer you to systems theory for the precise definition. When I say cognitive, it has a precise meaning in systems theory, and all complex dynamic systems are cognitive by nature, not just human minds, okay? So cognitive has a specialized meaning here, but that meaning of cognitive is directly related to information coming into the system, the way the system treats that information, uses that information, changes internally as a result of that information, and then the way that system behaves in its interactions with the larger systems that it's a part of or the other systems that it's adjacent to and interconnected with, okay? So that's awakening. Now the Brahma Viharas a bit simpler, and we can actually understand the Brahma Viharas in terms of those 5 things that we use to define awakening. So another way of looking at codependent origination is that there is an interconnectedness of absolutely everything, and there actually are no things in these everything. There is only process, okay? That is what's now known as the insight into impermanence. So dependent arising predisposes in its true understanding that you realize that everything is process, and all of these processes are continuously interacting with other processes. They are the product of, and they influence other processes. So it's an ongoing flow of processes within processes interacting with each other in a systematic fashion. Is that getting too abstract for you? No. Okay, so it is possible when analyzing this to define in terms of self-organization natural individuals within this processes, all of this flow of process that's taking place. But those natural individuals don't have the qualities that the worldling attributes to a self. Okay. What they are is, what they're really defined by is the fact that they represent a nexus of causality that is self-organizing and self-maintaining. Okay? Now, does that make sense in terms of your experience of your mind and your experience of your body and its relationship to the rest of the universe? That what your mind and body are is just a process that is connected to all these other processes and a part of it, but it is self-organizing, and it has this quality of autopoiesis. Okay. Now, if we add to that that this process, cognitively, it is creating its own representation of the world, and there are limitations both in terms of the capacities of the system itself and the information that it has available to it that limit the relationship between the representations that it creates as a part of its self-organization leading to its behaviors, right? So what we could consider awakening to be is a shift to a place where one has used one's faculties in order to see and understand within one's limits the way things really are in terms of modeling reality in a superior way to what the average worldling does. And so this involves, so this is a recognition of emptiness. That the best I can ever come up with is a more functional illusion, okay? All right. And then we can sort of, let's see, what have we've got dependent co-arising, we have impermanence, we have no self, we have emptiness, oh yeah, suffering, right. That not recognizing that all of our suffering is a result of mechanisms that have evolved as a part of the system, that are inherent within the system, that serve a good purpose, but when the system uses them inappropriately, the result is the system is always experiencing, the system is always far from equilibrium, but it can be stable. And it's natural for the system to always be seeking stability. But to cognitively recognize that there will always be that instability as a part of the experience, then that relieves us of the suffering that we're talking about. So now we have this awakening. Now let's look at the Brahma Viharas. When you see things from this perspective, loving kindness is there spontaneously. Compassion is the transformation of the wanting system to a larger scale. Now the wanting system is wanting the same freedom from suffering for as many beings as possible. And then, okay, so, and likewise, this transformed system not only sees the suffering of others, something that they
I'm sorry, someone's joined the chat and hasn't muted their chat. Could you do that, please?
Yeah.
Sorry, so that we can just continue. Thanks.
Sure it is. Anyway, okay, so where was I getting to in this? Oh yeah, so sympathetic joy. It's the same thing, you know. The joy, the more joy there is in the world, then yeah, I'm a part of this whole thing, and that's what I want. And equanimity, you know, it's like I don't need to get this wanting system hyperactive about any of this. Now, so yes, awakening will give rise to the Brahma Viharas, but in what form? Okay. Now this is a complex system. We have a new way of looking at things. As a matter of fact, in the Mahayana system, they don't even acknowledge that compassion is possible until you've achieved the path of seeing, equivalent of stream entry. Because before that, you're trapped in this worldly view, and your compassion is going to be of a superficial nature. Not that it can't be deep, not that it can't be heartfelt, but it is going to be very much subject to the larger perspectival conditioning that you carry with it. Now, that changes, but that change, that cognitive shift that constitutes awakening, doesn't automatically change everything. There are, after all, described by the Buddha, 4 different paths. And the 4th path is a path, and there's good evidence that there's many paths beyond that as well. So what we're talking about here is the Brahma Viharas may be there to a greater or lesser degree, but there's a whole lot of other factors that are going to determine how they manifest. And just a very blatant example is the monks in the monasteries in pre-Chinese invasion Tibet, living in comparative luxury at the expense of peasants who were living in poverty. Now the peasants were happy, and having the monastery there and having the monks there and the teachings there and the promise that if they went about things in the right way, they would be reborn in the fortunate with the good karma to become monks themselves, and as monks they could eventually escape the cycle of pain and suffering and death and rebirth, and they wouldn't have to be peasants living outside the monastery anymore. And so this was a kind of a system where the monks developed compassion, but compassion didn't become action in the world except in the limited sense that they were providing comfort to these people in their suffering, and they were promising them a way out, and they were teaching them the way to enlightenment. But at the same time, they were accepting a percentage of the return on all of the labor of all these people living in poverty around them. So does this kind of get to where the question, if somebody practices TMI and never does metta meditation, they are going to experience metta, but how is it going to manifest? Depends on all kinds of other factors. Many more factors than just whether or not they've practiced metta meditation. Although practicing metta meditation or practicing Lojong or any of the other practices that like that play an important role. There's no way to, all right. So you take them collectively, and they're there. They're real. They're a part of a new perspective that represents awakening. How they manifest is going to depend both on where on the path of awakening someone is, and it's also going to depend on a whole lot of other factors that are interconnected with, but not necessarily a part of those that we've used to define the cognitive shift. Mm-hmm. So actually what we could stand to have would be a more complete definition, which would say, and I think this is what Ken Wilber was trying to get at. We need a more complete definition that says, you've got to grow up. You've got to develop these things independently. You can't just expect them to come with a cognitive shift.
Right. And I think that's where I was kind of going with that question, is that, and I'll use my own practice to illustrate this, is as I'm moving through the stages, I'm finding that my compassion, my love for other people is increasing. And I'm finding it difficult to reconcile that with the idea that these are orthogonal processes
Mhm.
that are happening completely independent of each other. I think my experience is that they are reinforcing each other, and that they are actually growing. And I find it difficult to believe that, someone has really developed compassion and yet they cannot act compassionately, or that they really are developing joy and not behaving in a way that speaks to that joy. And that's what I find troubling, because I've listened to a lot of talks about this now, about, Yoshu Sasaki Roshi, for example, the Japanese, like, that went out and he really took advantage and abused his students and things like that. And yet he's still regarded as this highly awakened person. I find an inherent contradiction in those two ideas. And I like that you brought up the systems theory, because it talks about that. These are reinforcing, self-reinforcing connected processes.
Yes.
As far as I'm
Well, look
concerned.
at the example I gave you. If somebody grew up in and became awakened in a culture where that was taught as this is how compassion manifests, then true compassion arises, but it arises in a context that says, and this is how you be compassionate. And so some within that group may see beyond that, but obviously the majority did not, and that the cultural effects and other effects imposed upon them by their peers is going to play a huge role in all of this, right? So
no, and that's absolutely fair, and it's something that we talk about in psychology a lot, is the way that culture impacts the way that we see very basic concepts, such as what it means to be truthful to people, for example, or what it means to behave in a appropriate way.
well, let's look at this third one in the same way, what you referred to as ethics. Now, I'd like to make a technical distinction here. Technically, ethics are a set of man-made rules applying to a particular situation, okay? And so the legal profession has its set of ethics, which they have agreed upon. The medical profession has its set of ethics. There are also unspoken ethics, which are embedded in various cultural systems. So ethics are things that are man-made and arrived at through agreement. And what they are is the attempt of human beings. We seem to be genetically predisposed to make a distinction between good and bad, or good and even, we can make it evil, or right and wrong, or things like this. This is something that seems to be naturally present, but it's not defined past that. Culture is what defines it past that. And in more sophisticated cultures, this becomes this becomes ethical systems, and they even become applied to, like I say, specific groups and specific times. Each church has a slightly different set of ethics, and each profession has a slightly different set of ethics. Now, we want to distinguish ethics from morality. Morality is looking to try to find something that is not culturally fabricated, something that is, you might say, a self-existent value, right? Now,
yeah, and sorry to interrupt you there, but I think that I should have said morality, probably, because I mean, we all know that we as human beings, they've done tons of experiments about this. If your average human being sees somebody else being hurt, they experience that as a bad thing. There's an empathy in that. So I suppose that's what I'm talking about, rather than the man-made systems that we.
Right. So yes, and many people, like people originally derived morality from the idea of a God that had created things, and he created a set of rules. And since they came from God, they met that criteria of being some kind of absolute or ultimate. Subsequently, philosophers have looked and looked and looked. Scientists, social scientists and scientists both have declared there is no ultimate moral principle, which I find an absurdity, but it's one that's derived at through linear thinking. But, you know, so I thought, well, what moral principle is there? Well, the Buddha gave me one and it works for me. He basically said, life is full of pain, right? You know, birth is painful, life is painful, disease is painful, aging is painful. Unless it's instantaneous, death is usually painful, right? So, and he says, all beings wish to be free from pain and all beings wish to experience pleasure. Now, that being the case, this is the foundation for the only thing that I say is, you know, when I search in the world, I say, that is both, that meets the need for a moral principle, and it is sufficient in and of itself. That to knowingly increase the net total of pain and suffering in the world is inherently unwholesome. But we can't help doing that even if we don't want to, right? And anything that you can do that either avoids causing unnecessary and avoidable pain and suffering, or even better yet, that reduces some of the avoidable and unnecessary suffering that's already there, that's got to be wholesome. So that's all we need for a moral principle. Now, if we take that as a moral principle, what we would find is an awakened person is probably going to consciously or unconsciously have recognized that principle, and the Brahma-Viharas are a reflection of it, right? Okay. Now, but as with the Brahma-Viharas, what they do with it depends on many, many things. Now, we already have to acknowledge that we're not omniscient, so that we can do something that seems to be good and wholesome, but ultimately causes a huge amount of pain and suffering. And I like to use a little made-up story that in late 19th century Vienna, there's a pregnant woman and there's a runaway carriage, and the woman doesn't know it, and she's stepping into the street and going to be hit by the runaway carriage. And a well-meaning man on the sidewalk grabs her and pulls her out of danger's way. And the child she's carrying will eventually be known as Adolf Hitler. So, you know, but you can use a whole lot simpler examples than that too. We're not omniscient, so we can't be perfectly moral, but the attempt to be perfectly moral, the intention to be perfectly moral is what we can hope for. So there's also all kinds of other things that can, you know, like I say, having some recognition that there's a fundamental moral principle, and maybe even not having arrived at the one I've arrived at, but arrived at something else. That's the thing. Any cultural group is going to tend to generate its own moral principle. And individuals within it are going to agree with it to a greater or lesser extent. They're going to be highly predisposed to agree with it from birth, right? But they won't necessarily by the time they become adults. And of course, 19th and 20th century literature is full of examples of people who do not agree with the moral systems that they grew up with. So once again, you can only...
Look, I think my question is really a lot simpler than... I really get what you're saying in terms of how these things express themselves can be different depending on causes and conditions, again, ultimately. But I mean, how can it be that someone who is a highly awakened and realized person can do things that's against basic morality, against things that killing, abusing someone, or taking advantage of someone, that you don't need to be awakened to know that those things are not good things. This is a basic universal morality. And I really object to the idea that these things are like Ken Wilber says, cleaning up, growing up, waking up, showing up. These are totally different avenues of development to pursue.
They are not orthogonal. They are intertwined.
Thank you. I suppose that's what I wanted to get at. And my experience is showing me what I love about Buddhism is that it's like, okay, there's an idea, go out and try it for yourself and see if it makes sense.
Right.
And my experience in my limited, few years of meditating has been the more I meditate, the more I want to be a moral person or an ethical person. And I just, I have trouble accepting those ideas as people explain it away as that these are orthogonal trajectories that have to be developed independently of each other.
What if you're faced with a decision of the death of one person will save the lives of 1,000 people? Those are moral dilemmas.
Yeah.
Killing is, but
yeah, but I mean, those are extreme examples. I'm talking about everyday life, right?
Yeah, when every life, the same thing applies. If somebody is awakened to the degree that they're awakened, and to the degree that they have a whole lot of other things operating, discriminative abilities, native intelligence, knowledge, information, all kinds of things are going to enter into a decision they make. If the person is truly awakened, and in whatever degree to which they're awakened, they are going to be doing their best in order to be moral. And the only reason for raising an extreme situation is it helps us to understand an everyday situation where a person's past conditioning, the information available to them, their understanding of the situation may lead them to act in a way that they believe is moral, but you standing there either after the fact, looking back, saying, oh, that was immoral, look at all the harm that caused. Or you, with different information, watching them make the decision, say, oh, he's committing an immoral act. But if you have information that he doesn't have, then you have to understand that his not having that information is a very important part of his decision, or her. I shouldn't be sexist here, his or her. So the manifestation in action depends on many factors more. Now, the more awakened a person is, the greater the depth of understanding of these things. And most especially, the greater the depth of understanding of themselves. Now, this is where, now I agree with you in disagreeing with you somewhat with Ken Wilber's oversimplification. But it is the case that, know thyself. The more you know yourself, the more deeply you understand yourself and the world around you, then the more you are going to succeed at acting out of the moral impulse. And the moral impulse is going to grow in strength and power with your awakening. And indeed, we can see that if we take as the definition of immoral as to knowingly do something that will create more harm and suffering than an alternative course of action that is available to you, and to do it for selfish reasons, that is, you see, that's where we can begin to get black and white. Okay.
Yeah. And I don't think it's black and white. I think what I've read is it seems like every limb of the Eightfold Path are connected to each other. They're not separate, indistinguishable things, and that's why it makes sense why the Dalai Lama was so confused when someone asked him, well, why does someone have this? And he says, well, they're not practicing the Eightfold Path. You can't just meditate, have right speech, right action, right livelihood. And I think that's an important thing to mention to people. Yes, they are different aspects that need to be developed, but they're not independent aspects. They are self-reinforcing. That's what I love about the Buddha's work, is that it's a self-reinforcing, interconnected system, right?
I was going to mention the Eightfold Path. The way to regard the Eightfold Path is the way you would a braided cable. So you could, in the division, you can divide the Eightfold Path into three, and each of those three components you could regard as being a twisted, braided cord. And then the Eightfold Path as a whole is where those individual cords are all braided together. Or you could say the threefold division is arbitrary, because the way I see it, they are interconnected in a way that kind of segregation isn't really all that accurate, okay? So you could think of it more as 8 strands, all of which are braided together. Or you could think of it as 3 separate cables that are braided together to make a single stronger cable. Now that's the kind of thing that happens when you say, okay, I'm going to take only these 3 strands that represent meditation, and those others are all nice, but they're for some other day or for someone else. You know, well, what you have not got a very strong cable there, right? You've got a rope.
I like that. I like that explanation of it. Sorry about my camera being off. Yeah, it just seems like I suppose I was getting a little disillusioned by the idea that these are supposedly separate things, and yet the Buddha did not describe them as separate things. He described them as all essential for the end game, if you like.
Yeah. Bill has been wanting to say something for a long time, and I usually like what Bill says, so I'm selfishly want to hear what Bill has to say.
Well, one of the things that it reminds me of in many of the talks that I heard from you was where you said that one cannot really advance in awakening without the application of Shila. That as long as Shila remains unfulfilled, there's going to be a level of agitation which will prevent awakening. The other comment that I was going to say was that I think it's been shown in many of the herd type animals that there is a natural inborn thing to care for each other. And it's probably at least very beneficial for mothers to care for their children of any species, for that species to continue. So there is a certain natural basis for morality and kindness. The idea of calling somebody awakened, I think, and they commit immoral acts, I think that by committing the immoral acts shows that, in fact, they are not awakened.
Yes. Well,
thank you, Bill. That's what I was going for. Thank you. I think you said it very well.
Okay, except for the problem that I raised. How do you judge the morality of a particular act? Now, you can say that act, in terms of this definition, like I say, the man, theoretically, the man who saved Adolf Hitler's mother created a huge amount of pain and suffering in the world as a result. But that did not make his act immoral. That's why the Buddha moved this whole thing to the realm of the individual and his intentions, and pointed to the intentions being a reflection of craving and self-clinging. So taking it, you cannot isolate sila from right understanding and right view. One is the cognitive, and without the cognitive of right understanding, what is what is sila other than a set of rules? And blindly following those rules is going to be of minimal value. It's going to make you a well-behaved member of society, and that's about it. And the conative part, if that understanding is only intellectual and it doesn't form and shape your intentions, thereby opening the door to recognizing the arising of craving and self-clinging, that's the second part of the Eightfold Path. And these first two together are one of the three cables that are wound together to make the whole cable of the Eightfold Path. We cannot separate sila from these, okay? So our judgment of the morality of the action of a person is going to have to take that into account as well. So we can look at it from the point of view of the ultimate, but we also have to look at it from the point of view of the relative. So ultimately, the consequences of that man saving that woman were the cause of a tremendous amount of suffering. But the event itself was not immoral, okay? And that's the way, and systems theory allows us, you know, when we see we are systems within systems within systems. The fault lay not with the man saving the woman. The fault lay within the much larger systems, and the cultural system of Europe, and indeed the cultural system of the entire world, because it also involved Japan and Russia. These played as much a role. I mean, the travesty of the November 11th, 1918 settlement was as much responsible for the suffering that we attribute to Hitler as contributed far more to that than did that man's act of saving that life. Hitler could have become a saint. The thing is that nothing is that simple, right? Nothing is that simple. And if we recognize that, then it allows us to be far more compassionate, to exercise far more loving kindness. And so you cannot separate these things. You cannot separate the right understanding and the right thought and intention, the second noble truth. You can't separate the first and the second noble truth from the third, fourth, and fifth noble truths. Not only that, in order to practice the third, fourth, and fifth noble truths, you need the sixth, seventh, and eighth. You can't not develop right effort and right samadhi and right sati and be successful in practicing sila.
Yeah, no, I think that's the problem with Western Buddhism. With perhaps I'm making a blanket statement here, but Western Buddhism with pragmatic Dharma is that you can't take these things just out. You can't just take out meditation, or you can't just take out one part of it and expect it to have the outcome, the effect that was intended. Yeah. They all have to be practiced, right?
That's right. That comes from the kind of thinking that has predominated since the time of Newton until the time of people like, beginning with Ilya Prigogine and Fritjof Capra and the fellow that helped found Mind and Life with the Dalai Lama. What's his name? Anyway, the world of science has undergone a transformation in thinking. And that old-fashioned linear kind of thinking can't give us the answers we need. We have to think in terms of complexity and systems theory. We have to think in terms of dependent arising. We have to think in terms of there being self-organizing systems, but there being no self in those self-organizing systems. They are merely places that energy and matter flow through temporarily. When we understand it that way, then all of a sudden it's much easier to comprehend, and we don't run into the same confusions and contradictions and conflicts. So we did end up going into this much more depth. But like I said, once your terms are defined and you understand them clearly, it's a fairly simple question. No, they're not orthogonal. They are interdependent.
Interdependent,
But they are not solely interdependent on each other. They are a part of something much larger as well. And there are many
systems theory is beautiful, right? And that's and Buddha understood this 2,500 years ago.
He did. He understood it. He did. Yes, Shantanu, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to give an example. This question has also bothered me, like pretty much. I mean, I could have been asking that question. And there was an example I read somewhere where they said that to train for better snipers, they use meditation, right? So you can actually shut off the sila and the panya part, and you can use samadhi to actually be a very destructive being. You might not be wise, but you will have a lot of stable attention to, you know, go after somebody that you want to kill, right?
Look at the Japanese culture of the samurai.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's a brilliant example, Shantanu. I think that's amazing. That really puts it very simply.
Yeah. Yes, the military just loves mindfulness. All SEAL teams, all of their special ops teams, they get a lot of training in mindfulness. They also get a lot of training in a very limited form of not so much no self, but an expanded self. So a unit consisting of, say, half a dozen men efforts will be made to make them so interdependent upon each other that they not only feel but act as a single unit. And this is essential to their success, that a member of one of these teams on an operation knows what everybody else in that team is doing and going to do, just because they know them so well. It's almost as though they had kind of a telepathic bond between them. And this makes them an enormously powerful weapon. So anything can be subverted.
I think that just shows that anything can be abused, right? Any system can be manipulated in a way that isn't good, and that we should be on the lookout for that sort of thing, and especially with ourselves. I think the only person we can really have influence on is ourselves.
Right. So what didn't we get to here?
I think we covered actually all my questions there. So thank you. That was a really, really helpful discussion.
Well, it was a very enjoyable discussion. I loved the opportunity to share it with you. Are either Sean or Gunnar with us today?
Gunnar is. I don't know about Sean.
Gunnar?
I'm here. Hey, Culadasa. Gunnar, it's me.
Yeah, let's have a look at your question here. I know we're kind of running over time.
Actually, I was wondering if I could rephrase it, given some recent clarity I got.
Yeah.
Okay. Can you hear me all right? I'm assuming yes.
I can,
so,
yeah.
I'm having trouble with donuts, yeah? And in some sessions, I have to constantly do the technique of pursed lips and the breathing technique. But I'm trying to increase the length of my sessions. So when I get to 30, 35 minutes, I don't look at the clock, but I guess sometimes I even have to step up, do some yoga movements or whatever, something to try and get really to wake up, right? I've tried two things which have been interesting in that respect. One, which is what this question regards, is kind of forcing thoughts to come up out of, to appear, which is an interesting thing. it felt a little bit like the noting technique, or maybe, I don't know, but it worked, right? I don't know how productive it was in my path, but the dullness kind of subsided a little bit, right? Another thing which I have tried these past days is keeping in the scope of my awareness the spatial awareness of my immediate environment, right? And which helps me also remind myself of what I'm doing. And that is something that I'm taking with me throughout the day. And it's a magnificent experience, which I hadn't realized before, right?
Yes.
And every time I'm gonna get to the question, sorry. And every time I get this awareness of the immediate environment I'm in, and which brings back to what I'm doing right now, my breathing picks up again. It's like, how often can I forget to breathe? And how much air do I actually need? It's fantastic. It's like totally surprising. I feel like I'm a machine that needs so much more oxygen than I thought I needed. So ultimately, to have a focused question, right? So donors, right? With this spatial awareness technique or whatever, including that in my awareness, it's working well. I don't feel the donors so strongly anymore. And because of my pacifying the mind, I understand, or unifying it, the sensations of the breath are my focus, the center of my attention most of the time. It's not as strongly as before, but it definitely gravitates toward that. So whereas before I would have a very clean sensation of the breath in my nose, and I could feel very distinctively parts of it, and I was even trying to break it down into, frames, far away from that, but, striving to do that. But now it's not as clear, but I'm also not as dull. Does that become a question? Did that become a question? I'm not sure.
Largely answered your own question. I can contribute a little bit. When I read the phrases "stop thoughts" and things like that, whenever somebody says they stop thoughts, there's red flags waving, red lights blinking, sirens going on in the background. Thoughts shouldn't stop. What should happen is they should go in the background, and then there should be a point around stage 6 or stage 7 where verbal thoughts continue, but those verbal thoughts, they kind of find a way. But there's always something going on in the mind. There's always, except, there is a phenomenon of brief intermittent experiences of the mind at rest, brief experiences of mind at complete rest. But most of the time, there's always something going on in the mind. So that's why and so I knew that what you were doing is you're using a kind of dullness. And this is something that I've seen many people do who misunderstand the point of meditation. The point of meditation is my meditation object should be the only thing in my consciousness, and everything else should be gone. Now, what you introduced me to, which I absolutely love, is just so obvious. Why it never occurred to me to use it with somebody in a practical sense, and I will should the occasion arise. I've always think of, you develop introspective awareness, that becomes metacognitive. And metacognitive introspective awareness includes the extrospective eventually. And once it does, you have just metacognitive awareness. But I think the way I thought of it, the reason I thought of it the way I did, is that ultimately extrospective awareness really is part of what you introspect, because it's only an illusion that it's out there, right? So I've always thought of it and taught it in that way. But what you said, and as a technique, it's really valuable. I like it. I love it. You can make your extrospective awareness metacognitive. And if you do, it now includes you and what you're doing. So, hey, hooray for you. Thank you. That's brilliant. God, you know,
That helps. That helps a lot. Thanks.
I realize now that this is something that Shinzen's been teaching for years, and I just now caught on. Okay. Well, thank you, Gunnar. You've been helpful to me, and you recognize your problem, and you have the tools to deal with it. And hey, let me know if you need more help with it. But gee, it seems like you've done a wonderful job of cracking the nut here yourself, and you know what to do.
Thanks, and let me know if you need any more tips. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. No, thank you. This is really good. Thanks.
You're very welcome. You're very welcome. So what are we leaving undone here? Vladislav.
Hi, Culadasa, I'm here.
Yes. Hi. It's good to see you here.
I'm sorry I don't have a camera right now, but it's good to see you too.
So I'm just going to read.
Shantu Shakar's here too.
Yeah.
Before.
Oh, yeah. Great. Okay. Well, looks like we've already gone over time. I guess once we've gone over time, why quit? Except I know that there's another group there's a subset of our current group that was planning to try to meet together before noon. So I can't make everybody happy, can I? So let me look at Shantanu's question here first. Around the use of volition, will to generate concentration. I understand will, volition as an active choice, even forceful choice to pay attention to the breath and pushing the desires and aversions into the background. The stronger the desire aversion, the more force of active choice is needed. Yep, this helps me trace my breath continuously with awareness that there is background noise present. After a while, the mind shifts into a state where the active effort is not needed any further and the background noise has disappeared or considerably reduced. However, this appears like a strategy to force desires, aversions out of consciousness temporarily, because when they come back outside of meditation sitting is not so effective to use this strategy. I also get a sense that this strategy makes the desires, aversions stronger when they return. Is this use of volition to generate concentration counterproductive? Absolutely. As you have yourself given good testimony here. The entire idea that there is someone there who generates will, applies will, who can force one part of the mind, you know, this is all a very harmful illusion. You're reinforcing the idea of some little guy in the middle of your head, somewhere halfway between your ears and your eyes and the back of your head, sitting in the commander's chair, you know, who's in control of things. And there just ain't no such thing. What's really happening is you're training a few sub-minds of your mind system to get together and bully the rest into submission. And that the submission that takes is a form of dullness. And not only that, the ones that have been bullied into that aren't going to take it sitting down. They're going to come back and they're going to, you know, the first weakness they see in the dominant coalition, they're going to stage an insurrection.
That's what happens.
Give up on that idea. Let the little idea of the guy in the chair who's in control recognize it. All I can do is ask, let the rest know what they want. And if I do it in a nice, gentle, understanding way and everything, and point out to them the benefits of it, then they're much more likely to cooperate. And the more of them that are cooperate, then the better, the happier we'll all be, and the more the rest of them will want to cooperate as well. So limit your imaginary guy to forming and holding intentions, and if And I've realized that there's another way to, you know, I always said the word intention because to me, that's like I intend to raise my arm, but if my nerves were damaged or if I had a strap around my arm, there's all kinds of other things that could keep that from happening, right? Yeah. Somebody could have injected an anesthetic into my nerve and then nothing would happen, right?
Right.
So another word is an aspiration. Form and hold an aspiration. Get as much of your mind as online as you can to hold the aspiration that these things are going to happen, and let them take care of themselves. Let the mind system train itself.
So what should I look at? What is that system or entity that forms the intention?
The entity that what attention?
That forms the intention. Who is it? Who or what is it that is forming the intention?
That is the coalition of your subminds that, for one reason or another, have come to the decision that you want to be a meditator, that you would like to have the benefits of that. And part of your mind system has made observations and formed this this wish and this aspiration. And there's the rest of your mind system that, hey, they're not sure whether this is such a good thing or not. And you've got to persuade them. Or not you, but the part of your mind system that's decided that this is a really good thing for all of us. You know, just think of it as a whole group of people. And there's a part of that group that have figured out something that, hey, you know, we'd all be better off if we did things this way. But, you know, you have to persuade, you have to demonstrate, you have to say, look, I'm just going to demonstrate to you that this is a good thing. So just give me a chance. Let's just try it for a few minutes. And some of them say, yeah, I can see where this might be a good thing. And then it becomes easier and easier. So
thank you.
That's who you really are that's wanting to meditate, is just in that moment. And it may not last long, but in that moment that gets you on the cushion, there's enough subminds that think it's a good idea. And then it's up to them to take advantage of that opportunity to convince a few more.
Okay. Thank you.
So, okay. All right. Now, yeah, we're pushing 2 hours here, but since Vladislav is here, okay, so Vladislav is talking about, you're talking about, you were doing a 10-day retreat and started contemplating no self, and then finding the still point, realizing the witness. You began to experience panic-like fear. Your heart started racing like crazy. I had a feeling like something big and terrifying is about to happen. It got so intense that I couldn't handle it and had to stop meditating. It happened 2 times during the last 2 days of the retreat, and only during anatta contemplations. This is the first time something like this ever happened to me during meditation, so it was totally unexpected. What would you advise in this situation? How can I work around this fear if it arises again in daily practice? Or is no self-contemplation too early for me? After I stopped meditating, fear subsided rather quickly and I was back to normal. But in both cases, I could not continue meditating and had to stop. To give you some context of my practice, I was between stages 7 and 8 before retreat. Some days I could achieve effortlessness, but it was not consistent. And then by the 4th day of the retreat, I was consistently having effortless concentration. By the end of the retreat, I would often get meditative joy and piti, and bodily sensations rather faint and almost absent from awareness. So yes, Vladislav, I am so glad that you asked this question and raised it, and I'm so sorry that you've had this painful and uncomfortable experience. Now, understanding dependent co-arising and no self and emptiness of perceptions and that everything is process and there are no things at an intellectual level is one thing. It's when it gets down to the deeper parts of the mind system that actually are operating at a simpler level. Each of these insights is just one aspect of a single truth, okay? And so to push to recognize the truth that you aren't the separate self that you feel like you are and believe you are, without having developed these others in practical and deeply experiential ways, it's going to produce a violent reaction. The egoic self is the creation of the higher cerebral functions, but the sense of self has its origins much more deep in the brain, in the brainstem. It's much more primitive, and it has to do with the sense of being a body, and being a body who is at risk of dying. And its purpose is to keep that body, or if we go to systems theory, okay, it's to keep the system from disintegrating. It's to make sure that the inflow of matter and energy, and then the processing that takes place and the outflow of matter and energy keeps the system intact and operating. And that's the simple way it views things. And that gets elaborated into by the emotional brain. It ascends to the next level in the brain. The emotional brain, it becomes the feeling of being a separate self. And I've got to it carries with it this, I've got to take care of myself. Now, when the no self message comes down, but without the, well, I'm really not a thing, I'm a process. Not only am I a process, but I'm a part of a much greater process. And everything that's important about me being an individual body and mind is still there. It just doesn't require that I need to carry it to the extreme of somehow being a separate entity who is always the same, because I'm a constantly changing process. And I can change, and it's not the same as dying. I have changed all my life. I'm changing every day, and it's not the same as dying. Because if the message is now getting to the lower part of the brain, it gets interpreted differently. In the emotional brain, it gets interpreted as, I'm going to die, right? I'm me is this body and mind. And no self, that's a death sentence. And of course you're going to feel afraid. So what do you need to do? You say, as you're not ready. And I would say, yeah, you're not ready in isolation. All of these things work together. You've got to understand that clinging to self is actually causing all of the suffering in your life. You've got to understand that the mind is a storyteller. And all of your unhappiness in your life has been because you've been telling lousy stories. Your mind could learn to tell better stories and you'd be a happier person. All of these things have to, it's better that they come first. The Buddha didn't start out teaching no self. He got to that. But first he started out and he said, life is painful, but it's full of suffering that doesn't need to be there. You see, that's that whole clinging, self-clinging and storytelling, and good things happen, but then you lose them and they pass away, and bad things keep happening, and no matter how hard I try, life's a no-win game. You can't win, you can't break even, and you can't get out of the game, to quote a famous physicist. Recognizing the role that this imagined self is playing, that's something that needs to come. It needs to come earlier on. You need to realize, before the realization of how empty all of your perceptions are, you've got to start recognizing that a lot of your perceptions are just stories. They're just confabulations. And Byron Katie, you know, she recognized this and she managed to help a lot of people by saying, what is your story? Is it true? What if it was different? And people discovered how much they lived by their stories. That needs to come before no self. Discovering where your suffering and unhappiness is coming from by degrees. It's seeing, understanding your interconnectedness, understanding that the separate selfhood that you legitimately want to preserve the integrity of is not a solid, tangible thing. And the protection of that doesn't require an illusory boundary. It doesn't require that kind of storytelling. You know, then you get to know self, and it's like, hey, yeah, I mean, this was kind of I was kind of realizing this by degrees for quite a while now. You know, everything arises and passes away. I arise and pass away, but it's not all about I was born and I die. It's like I arise and pass away every night when I go to sleep. I pass away. Every morning when I wake up, I arise until I don't. During the course of the day, I go from one situation to another. I'm not the same person in the first situation that I am in the second situation. I'm always changing. Something happens in my life, I'll never be the same again. Everything, and if I get down to it, everything that happens in my life changes me. This experiential realization, and meditation is designed to open you up to being able to see this and allow this information to be assimilated. And then there comes a point where the mind is ready to start putting it together, right? If you force the game, and you just try to force it to no self, you're going to get a hell of a lot of pushback. The emotional brain is going to say, you know, this is my death you're talking about, and your heart rate's going to go up, and you're going to experience all the same things you would if somebody was coming at you with a knife or a club or a gun, right? So I'm sorry that you had to go through this, but just, I think it'll be enough if you just don't go that far in that direction just quite yet, okay? And focus on these other things. And, you know, as I was talking to Shantanu about, in the Mind Illuminated, I try to prepare people over and over again, stage after stage, the descriptions in the mind system, both fifth interlude and the seventh interlude, and even in the sixth interlude. I'm trying to plant the seeds and let the plants spread and grow at an unconscious level with that root system develop that recognizes that there is no me in charge of this. It's all in us, right? It's all in us. And the only thing that I'm going to lose is an illusion. And what I'm going to gain is worth so much more than what I lose. What I'm going to gain is a greater truth about who and what I am and my relationship with the world. Better yet, what I'm going to gain is less negative storytelling and less suffering as a result. What I'm going to gain is less tendency to do the things that cause me to suffer, to cling to things in an unhealthy way that are going to make me suffer. You know, so the gain, that's the message that you want no self to be accompanied by the message that, hey, the only thing that's being lost here is a troublemaking illusion. And what's being gained is so much greater than that. It is more real. It is more valuable. It is more functional. It is better for me. It's better for everyone around me. So do you think you can do that, Vladislav?
Sure. Thank you. That was a great explanation. And it's exactly like the feeling of death. I was feeling like I'm about to die. And I'm working on all these other aspects in my life, both practically and during my practice, like right speech, right concentration, all this stuff. I just think I pushed no self a little too hard during that retreat. Yeah, but I'll take your advice to heart, and I will try to go more gently. Thank you very much.
Bring your mindfulness into daily life. Practice sila in every way. That's what that mindful review chapter is about, and that will help an awful lot. And I don't know to what degree that you practice metta, but metta meditation is going to help enormously, because it's going to give the mind, you're going to condition the mind as a system to have a new, very powerful attractor, okay? The state of loving kindness, the state of being free from ill will, you know, the state of being at peace with everything and everyone, and needing nothing and wanting nothing and being happy in yourself. Having that state available rather than what has already been developed as a very powerful attractor that is hard to avoid and hard to get out of is fear, especially fear of death or fear of loss of some kind. So practice metta meditation. Allow your mind system to develop a different kind of much more wholesome state that it can enter into. Okay? And it's also a state that is predicated on exactly those kinds of insights that you want, that will counteract. I mean, loving kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, these are all predicated on not being so attached to the personal self, right? So this is a much more wholesome state. So cultivate it. And it may seem a bit contrived at first, and that doesn't matter. That doesn't matter, because it is real, and the reality of it will make itself evident.
Yeah, actually, I started practicing metta after that retreat, and I really enjoy it. So, thank you very much.
People discover their own way given time, but yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'm glad I could help you. So I think it is now 12:01, and I need to take a break. So see you in a couple of weeks. Leaves us with something to catch up with, and hope you enjoyed this morning as much as I did. Well, I shouldn't say this morning, whatever time of day it is. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did.
Thank you, Culadasa.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, bye.